In this episode, we resume our county series where we take a county, discuss a little history and geography, what sights you can see when you visit and travel through that county, and I'll share some of personal anecdotes of my own experiences as well. This is the third I've done in a series of California counties. I'll link the videos I did in San Mateo and Santa Cruz counties in the description. I do enjoy this section of California immensely, and I've visited many times throughout my life. What I kind of like about it is I come from the Northeast where the weather can be kind of extreme. So what I like about this part of California is that it's not extreme. It's always pretty mild. The summers are not too hot, not too humid. The winters are not too cold. So you can get a little bit of nice relaxing in between weather all year round. And that's something that I really appreciate coming from the Northeast. But I will say the geography varies greatly in Monterey County and some of the other counties. You get coastal areas, farmland, rolling hills, forests, mountains, and badlands. And, you get a lot of different landscapes. And with each of those landscapes, you get kind of microclimates. So in some places, it can be a little bit hotter and drier. In other places, a little bit cooler and mistier. But that's really what's nice. You can travel and kind of get these different experiences as you go along. So I have a lot of good memories of Monterey County, and I will share those as we take a closer look at it. So I started this trilogy on these California counties with San Mateo, then did Santa Cruz, and that's kind of what I experience when I come into California. Because I come in through San Francisco Airport and then slowly work my way south, first through San Mateo County and then Santa Cruz County, and then eventually I get to Monterey. So you have Monterey Bay, which forms a kind of half moon shape, and at one corner of that half moon is Santa Cruz City, and then at the other end you have Monterey City and its neighboring town of Pacific Grove. And I always enjoyed traveling on Highway 1 to the famed Pacific Coast Highway, which has gorgeous views. In the interior of Monterey County, you have US Route 101, which runs parallel to Highway 1, and it also can be taken through Santa Cruz and into San Francisco Airport as well. The largest city in Monterey County is Salinas, which has about 100,000 people and is now slightly larger than Albany, New York. The first thing that comes to mind when I think of that city is the famous road trip song Me and Bobby McGee, written by Chris Christopherson and covered by many musicians over the years, including Roger Miller and Janis Joplin. It begins in Baton Rouge and the road trip ends somewhere near Salinas in Monterey County. And I would say that Monterey sits around that kind of Mason-Dixon line differentiating between Northern and Southern California. I do think that most Californians kind of think of it as Northern California, but I do think it does start to show some elements of Southern California culture and vibes that differentiate it a little bit from Santa Cruz and San Mateo County, especially as you start traveling further south into Monterey County. You're going to start to see a little bit of a different element. You're going to start to see more sports cars. You're going to start to see more manicured lawns and some of that sort of Hollywood element that you kind of associate with Southern California, but only to a point. You're not quite in Southern California. I think when you start going further south of Monterey County, that's when you really get into Southern California proper. But I think in Monterey, you're starting to get into that middle zone, which kind of also makes it a pretty interesting place to look at. One of the first communities you'll come across in northern Monterey County is Moss Landing. It's a community heavily tied to farming, but also fishing and boating. I took this picture between two boats there in Moss Landing, where about half a dozen seals were there lounging. Seals and sea lions are very common in Monterey County. One of the times I visited Moss Landing, I took a boat ride that went out around Monterey Bay, and we saw some different wildlife out on that boat ride, including a lot of seals and sea lions, which I mentioned earlier, but also a fairly large number of dolphins. And this really impressed me for a few different reasons. Again, it's something that I don't often see coming from the interior Northeast. But I also remember when I was younger, and there was real concern about declining dolphin populations. But in recent years, the dolphin population has really rebounded in this part of California, and I saw a healthy amount of them in this boat ride near Moss Landing. There were also a couple whales that I saw on that boat ride, and that was pretty cool too, but there weren't nearly as many whales as there were dolphins and seals and sea lions. So it's too bad that I'm not so used to the ocean, as I must say I felt some queasiness towards the end of this boat ride, and when it was done, I was ready for it to be done and ready not to be on another boat ride for a while. So it kept me from doing this ride again on that trip. I had the opportunity, but I kind of passed it. it. But it was a great experience nonetheless, and I would do it again now in a heartbeat if I had the chance, because it was really a cool thing. You get to see a lot of this nice wildlife, and it's really a nice experience. The other thing that is very noticeable in northern Monterey County is all the farmland. The land is a little flatter here than San Mateo and Santa Cruz County, allowing for better farmland. And its temperate climate allows a lot of different kinds of produce to grow. Berries are grown in abundance, for example. And where I'm from, berries are certainly grown, but they only grow for about 3 weeks of the year, and that's it. Whereas here in Monterey County, there's a much longer growing season. Same thing with the likes of nectarines, peaches, lettuce, spinach, and broccoli. Again, those things are grown where I'm from, but not nearly for as long of a growing season as you would see here. But there's also things grown here that are not grown in the Northeast where I'm from, and that includes a lot of citrus fruits like lemons, limes, grapefruits. There's kiwi grown. There's also a lot of different kinds of nuts. So you can stop at farm stands along Highway 1 in Monterey County and get really lots of good deals, a lot of inexpensive prices for a lot of this produce, so you can pick up kind of farm fresh. But the product that is the real gem of this area, the first crop I think of when I think of this part of California, is artichokes. As I mentioned in my Italian American food video, artichokes are an important part of Italian cuisine and I guess Mediterranean cuisine more broadly, but they're grown in very few climates. In the northeastern US, artichokes simply do not grow. So in the Italian American food culture, they're really kind of a special occasion food, not something that people eat regularly, because for most of the 20th century, it just wasn't really that available. If it was available, it would be very expensive. Now that's starting to change, but the culture, I think, kind of got embedded in that mindset of something that wasn't really available farm fresh in the Northeast. But in Monterey, it is an abundant crop, as the climate there is perfect for growing artichokes. And northern Monterey County is famous for them. Fried artichokes, for example, are a popular dish. They're fried usually with some sort of flour or breadcrumbs, and you could eat them with ranch dressing, although that's not my preferred way. I'd prefer it with either lemon, or actually both lemon and aioli, I think is a good combination. So it's a popular dish. You can sometimes go to different stands or huts and where they sell fried artichokes, or they also will have kind of diners and restaurants that kind of serve them as well. It's a very popular dish. You could also, besides getting fried artichokes as pictured here, you could also get artichokes in soup, sandwiches, or different kind of pasta dishes. So if you ever go to Monterey County, I will strongly advise embracing this artichoke culture, as it's really good food and a really good thing to kind of embrace. Castroville is another village near Moss Landing. Like a lot of northern Monterey County, it has a high percentage of Mexican American residents. I'd say probably the majority of the conversations I noticed when I was going through the different shops and businesses there was spoken in Spanish. It's also very highly tied to the agricultural culture of northern Monterey County, and the artichokes are very highly prized there as well. And interesting tidbit about Marilyn Monroe, and one of her early accomplishments was a beauty pageant that occurred in Castroville, where she won the Miss Castroville Artichoke contest. So that was an early kind of claim to fame for her, and it kind of shows how Castroville is tied to that artichoke culture I mentioned earlier. There had been a military base in northern Monterey County called Fort Ord that was built around the time of World War I, but it really came into prominence during World War II and the early Cold War that happened after that. So it was a very large facility at the time of its heyday and played an important part of the Monterey County economy at the time. But it closed in 1994, and it was then turned into a state park. So I did a meetup hike there for the Monterey County hiking meetup. I mentioned meetups in one of my earlier videos. I think a good way when you're visiting and trying to get to know a community is to participate in some of these meetups and having a chance to mingle and talk to people from the local area. So I got to meet a lot of cool people on this hike that I did in Fort Ord, and I got to say they were in terrific terrific shape. I considered myself in pretty good hiking shape at the time, much better than I am now. But a lot of these people, and a lot of them were older than I was, but they were out hiking me. I was definitely sore and, kind of feeling tired by about 2/3 of the way in. But I was looking around at some of these older hikers and they hadn't even broken a sweat. But anyway, when you see this landscape here at the Fort Ord National Park, it's very different than the sort of redwood environment that I talked about in my earlier videos in Santa Cruz and San Mateo County, where I did some hikes in those majestic redwoods. Here, the climate is very different. It's a lot more arid, a lot more like a badland. There's a lot of shrubbery, a lot of these kind of rock formations that you will see around. So it's much drier there. It gives a very different kind of vibe than a lot of those other kind of hiking experiences that I mentioned in my earlier videos. There's a moment there where you get to come across this herd of goats. It's very strange, but there's this herd of goats that's right in the middle of the state park there that you come across while hiking. So it was a pretty cool experience, a good hike, and a good chance to meet some interesting people from Monterey. Now I want to talk about the city of Monterey, and it has a very long and interesting history. If you go into the downtown, you see a lot of cool stuff in a very small area packed in. So there's a section called Old Monterey where you can get to learn a little bit about the history of the place. There's a lot of old buildings, and I'll show you a few more pictures in later slides. But Monterey was once the capital of California, and there's a custom house you can visit, and there's a theater you could visit. And there's also a waterfront area kind of right in the downtown, and I'll show some pictures of that in a moment. Also a pretty good food scene there. There's some good coffee shops there and some good Mexican food. I talked a little bit about Mexican food in my earlier videos, but I'll talk a little bit more here. You can definitely visit and get some good Mexican food in California. And I would say the difference between California Mexican food and other types, it's a little bit like Tex-Mex, but it has those kind of fresh California ingredients that, I think one can really appreciate. And this being a farming area, I think those fresh ingredients really pack a good punch. And also something that I like about this part of California, you can have these nice condiment bars where you can help yourself to different kinds of salsas and other condiments, pickled items that you can add to your food. So if you have some nice burritos or tacos, you can kind of add some of these different condiments. Some are spicier than others, some are smoky, some are sweet, and like I said, there's also those pickled items. And Monterey Jack cheese is an important part of California Mexican food culture, and it's I think a very good cheese to use for Mexican food because it melts very well, and it kind of has a smooth, mild flavor that I think complements some of those strong flavors that you'll get with the salsas and some of the other ingredients. So they're also very heavy in those kind of California ingredients like avocado, lime, cilantro is very heavily used. So those are kind of the characteristics of the Mexican food there. And you can get a lot of food for a very good price. I think it's a pretty good deal. So Monterey City has a lot of good sites, and I'll take a closer look at them in some of these other slides. Here's another picture of something that you can see in Old Monterey. It's the custom house, so you can go in there, you can explore and kind of get a sense of what Monterey was like in the 19th century. I mentioned the old theater, which is also something that you can visit, and that's pictured here. So downtown Monterey has a nice waterfront area, believe it or not, and you could go down by that water, and there's some rocks right off the land where seals will pretty much hang out, and you could get very close to them. You can see this picture here on the left. You see the seal kind of lounging on the rock there, and on the right, the picture there, it's zoomed out a little bit. You can kind of see the ships in the background. There's a port there in Monterey and a wharf, so those are some other sites that are right in the downtown. So like I say, you can see a lot of stuff, a lot packed into a small area. And this is in that same general area, just a little bit of a different angle. You see a seagull, but then in these rocky areas here, you see a bunch of different seals. They're kind of hard to tell what they are because they're the same color of the rock, so they kind of are camouflaged there. I think it's a little bit easier to tell maybe on these close-up shots, but in the further shots there, you can see the seals. You can get very close to them in Monterey, and it's kind of a cool experience. Again, if you're not from a coastal area, you don't get a chance to encounter seals a lot, but you can kind of encounter them very regularly in this part of California. And of course, I think seeing the boats in the background is also pretty cool. This might be my best shot. I like this kind of seal in the center that's looking at the camera, and in the background you see a couple of other seals. One is kind of swimming on its back there. So another pretty cool shot right there in downtown Monterey. So cool sights that you can see when visiting the city. Another neighborhood in Monterey is called Cannery Row. A lot of people mistakenly think that Cannery Row is downtown, but it's not. It's in Monterey, but it's in a different section, a different neighborhood outside of downtown. Now, Monterey always had a robust fishing industry, and to grow out of that would be this canning industry, where the fish would be taken to these industrial facilities and put into cans. So it started to develop in the early 20th century, and it gave Monterey a very gritty kind of blue collar vibe. Sardines were the fish that were most frequently canned in these facilities. Now, during the mid 20th century, the sardine population in Monterey Bay would see a decline, and that resulted in a decline in the canning industry overall. The canning facilities slowly started to close as we started to move into the 60s and 70s, and by the late 20th centuries, Monterey did not have these canning facilities anymore. But what had happened instead is that the area became more gentrified. They would build an aquarium there in 1984, and it became quite a tourist destination. And now there's also a lot of shops around the aquarium and in where a lot of these old canning facilities used to be. And you can get things like saltwater taffy there. I think they've got arcades there. You can buy different kinds of souvenirs and novelty items at these different shops that they've got there. So a good movie that took place in Monterey that really captures that blue collar gritty vibe that I mentioned was called Clash by Night, made in 1952. And this took place at a time when the fishing and canning businesses were still the main engine of the local economy, but it had been in a rut due to the decline in the sardine population that I mentioned. So it was still the main source of income, but it was a source of income that was on the decline. So I think the experiences of the different characters in the movie really kind of portray that sort of decline in their economic fortunes. A mature Barbara Stanwyck played the lead as a very flawed protagonist returning to Monterey after a hiatus. And the movie captures a certain slice of life as imperfect people try to navigate situations that are not ideal. A still kind of up and coming Marilyn Monroe co-stars in the movie. So she has kind of two ties to Monterey County, I guess. She won that beauty contest in Castroville, and now she's in this movie taking place in Monterey. And this would be a dramatic part for her. So she didn't really do a ton of dramatic movies, but this was definitely a very straight dramatic part. And I think she did a pretty good job. Now, Monroe, she had a reputation for not always being easy to work with, but Stanwyck was said to have mentored her and kept her on track as they made this good gem of a movie that I think is worth checking out. Earlier, I mentioned that I like to do meetups when I travel, and I went to a nice one in Monterey at a comedy club that was more uptown than downtown. Now, at the time, I was staying with my aunt who lives in a house in Santa Cruz County that's a bit off the beaten track on kind of a winding kind of a road there. So since I wanted to go to this comedy club meetup and thought I would be out late and maybe drinking a bit and not wanting to drive on those winding roads late at night, I got a very inexpensive motel room that was really two buildings down from the comedy club, so perfectly located. In between my motel and the comedy club was this adult video store, and that was the source of numerous jokes that the comedians told that night. Across the street was a diner, and I think it might have been a Howard Johnson's. So this was a fun meetup as I got the chance to hear some California comedy and meet some cool people. A couple of the women invited me to go to the diner with them after the comedy event had wrapped up, so that extended the evening a little bit. Now, it would have made for a good story if then they had gone with me to the motel room, but I must say that did not happen. And it might have made for a bad story if I had stopped at the adult video store, but I did not do that either, although both things certainly crossed my mind a bit briefly. So it was a fun night, and again, I would encourage people to do meetups like these where you get to, interact with the locals and get to know folks. Monterey is also known for the Monterey Pop Festival, which happened in 1967 and really launched the Summer of Love. It was sandwiched between Rhode Island's Newport Folk Festival and the Woodstock concert that happened a few years later. Monterey was heavy on California-based musical acts like the Mamas and the Papas, the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, the Byrds, Country Joe McDonald, and Otis Redding, although it did have some non-California acts like the Association, Simon and Garfunkel, and The Who. Besides some of these more established acts, the festival also had some up-and-coming musicians that would achieve more success later on, like the Steve Miller Band and the prolific songwriter Laura Nyro. John Steinbeck was an author who lived in Monterey County, and it was the setting for many of his famous works. Cannery Row was a book he wrote set in the aforementioned neighborhood in Monterey. An indubious battle took place in the county. It was the story about some union organizers, some leftists who were trying to organize apple pickers, and it was based on a true story. And much of East of Eden also took place in Monterey County as well. Another site you can visit is the Carmel Mission. It's important to remember that this section of California was once Spanish territory. I guess all of California was once Spanish territory. Missions played an important role in that part of history. Missions were not only religious centers, but they also served as centers for the larger communities. And they had phases throughout the mission's history where they had a more secular role and other stages where they had more religious roles. As a lot of the communities that would develop, a lot of the farms would develop around these missions, and the missions were kind of the centerpiece of these communities. So visiting the mission gives you a good glimpse into that era of California history. Another popular tourist destination is Carmel by the Sea. I must admit it's not a favorite destination of mine, as I always find it to be crowded with a lot of traffic jams, but it is very picturesque, and Clint Eastwood is said to have briefly been the mayor of the village of Carmel by the Sea. California is known for its wine, but most people, when they think of California wine, they think of the Napa Valley region as kind of the wine capital of the state. But Monterey County has a not too shabby bunch of wineries that I really enjoyed visiting. You can do a good wine hopping tour on Carmel Valley Road, which stretches away from the coast and follows this kind of windy path overlooking these beautiful rolling hills. The rolling hills present a nice contrast from some of the more rugged scenery that is prevalent for a lot of San Mateo, Santa Cruz, and even a lot of Monterey County. So this is again a different kind of topography, a different kind of terrain, and you can kind of see these kind of rolling hill type atmosphere as you're driving from winery to winery. So these views are more serene and relaxing and less stark than a lot of what you will see elsewhere in California. And there's different kinds of wineries that you can visit on these roads. Some are very nice looking, like the one pictured on the right there. But some of the wineries are in more modest looking buildings like the ones pictured here. But even though they're modest looking buildings, they're still nice wineries. And I've never been much of a wine connoisseur, but I do like the experience of going to wineries. And I find some very nice people working at some of these smaller, more downscale wineries. And the wine at these were quite good by my non-expert point of view. And you can see on the left here a kind of more modest looking winery, and on the right there more scenery. Now, I didn't mention on the previous slide, but there was a tiny bit of snow on some of those mountains. So in this part of California, it does get cold enough that you do get a little snow here and there in the higher elevations. Although, like I said, it doesn't get too cold. And like I said, it is very beautiful seeing these kind of rolling hills here and these different trees. As you go further south of Monterey and Carmel on Highway 1, you come across Big Sur, and these are huge oceanside cliffs. When I did my San Mateo video, I talked about how much I enjoyed traveling along Highway 1 and seeing the seaside cliffs in San Mateo County off of Highway 1. Now, Big Sur is much larger in scale, and it's quite breathtaking, but I must admit I prefer driving Highway 1 in San Mateo County, and the reason is when you drive on Big Sur, you feel like you can drive off the cliff at any moment to your death. It is a very steep drop, and the road is very windy. Other drivers God bless them, they drive very fast and they don't seem scared at all. They don't seem to be in fear of their lives the way I was when I was driving on it. I prefer calmer drives, but many people do enjoy Big Sur. And if you're one of those, it is definitely worth the experience. There was a smaller music festival that occurred from the mid 60s to the early 70s called the Big Sur Folk Festival. Joan Baez, who was living in Monterey County at the time, played a big part in organizing and keeping it going. It was more of a folk festival than a pop festival like the one in Monterey, and it was more low key by design. Besides Joan Baez, artists such as Joni Mitchell and the aforementioned Chris Christopherson, who wrote Me and Bobby McGee, they participated in the Big Sur Folk Festival. Judy Collins was a participant, and even the Beach Boys participated one year. Now let's shift and talk about some population statistics. It's worth noting that there was a huge increase in population Monterey County experienced during the course of the 20th century. California as a whole experienced a pretty big population increase during this time. Factors such as nice weather, the building of Fort Ord, the growth in agribusiness, tourism, and the pop culture image of California all helped with this increase in population. So as we can see here, in 1920, the population of the entire county was only about 28,000 people, and in 2000, it went to 400,000, a little bit above 400,000. So that's a huge change over that 80-year period. And each decade when they take the census, there would be double-digit increases in population, and some years much bigger than others. I think, as I said earlier, with Fort Ord being built and becoming a bigger and bigger facility, playing a more and more important part, I think that explains some of the increases that happened during the 40s and 50s in particular, as I think that was sort of the peak of the Fort Ord era. But also that growth in agribusiness, I think changes in the way crops would be grown, which allowed for longer harvest times. And that also called for more labor, and that increased the population as well. A lot of my videos on this channel have been centered on politics, but my travel-oriented videos have been less focused on politics. But I'll talk a little bit about politics here, and I want to say that it is good not to put politics front and center when trying to learn about a place or when visiting a place. Most of the experience you're going to have when you're traveling will be apolitical. And all the meetups I went to in California, only once did I talk politics with somebody, and that was when a mild-mannered gentleman on that Fort Ord hike that I mentioned earlier wanted to talk a little politics with me. And I happily oblige, as I like to talk about politics if it can be done in a mild-mannered way. But it really very rarely comes up on all the other meetups that I went to. Really, nobody ever brought up politics in any way, shape, or form. And, as I sort of traveled and visited different sites, I didn't see protesters or any other political signs or anything like that. So it's very rarely that you're going to even come across too much political stuff. But other than that, though, I think this point should be made, and I want to make it particularly to conservatives when talking about California, because California is certainly known these days for its progressive politics, and I think if you're conservative, you might be thinking about, well, maybe I should shy away from going to California because it is politically aligned differently than I am. But I would encourage people to definitely travel to places that are aligned differently than they are politically. If you're progressive, I would encourage you to travel to Middle America and see some of the different rural counties as well. And if you are more conservative, definitely, head out to California and see some of the sites there. I think it's good for the country to get around and to meet different people and kind of see where they're from and maybe get a better idea of, where they're coming from, both physically and mentally and culturally as well. So it can be a good learning experience, and I think that it'll help you kind of get to know how people tick. I should point out that Monterey, like much of California, was more Republican leaning in the mid 20th century. Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, and other Republicans did well here. Gerald Ford carried Monterey County in the 1976 presidential election, and George H.W. Bush carried Monterey County in 1988. The presence of Fort Ord had a lot to do with that, as the military was much more of a conservative entity in the mid to late 20th century than it is now. So having this big military presence and that military industrial complex added, I think, a good amount of Republican voters to the area and more conservative leaning voters. Things would shift later in the 20th century. In 1990, the Democratic gubernatorial candidate Dianne Feinstein would actually carry Monterey County, but she would lose the state as a whole to Pete Wilson that year. In 1992 and 1996, Bill Clinton will carry the county and win the rest of the state. Also in 1992, I think both Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein won the county in their Senate races. So why this shift? I think the shift occurred in the politics due to the shift in the agriculture that I mentioned earlier. There was more of a need for more workers to work these farms because of these changes in the agricultural techniques. And to fill that labor shortage, a lot more Mexicans moved into the area during that time. And Mexican Americans in California have always been a more Democratic voting bloc. So if you increase this demographic that tends to be more Democratic, you're going to see a larger percentage of voters voting Democrat in those elections. Also, the University of California will build a college in Monterey County, and that's going to increase the student and the academic adjacent population of the county, making it a bit more progressive. Also, the downsizing and eventual closure of Fort Ord will also lead to a decrease in that military presence I mentioned earlier, and that was a conservative presence. So it would get downsized in the 80s and early 90s, and it would finally be closed in 1994, and that was a big blow, I think, to the amount of conservatives and Republicans in the state. Also, I think the tourism sector to a degree tends to be a little bit more left-leaning, and that was also a factor as that tourism sector tended to increase during the late 20th century. And perhaps some of the pop culture portrayals of coastal California may have attracted a more conservative element generally, and maybe more liberal element. It's a little bit harder to quantify, but that may very well be the case. Now, some people will cite Proposition 187 as a measure that might have caused this change in party affiliation, although I'm a little skeptical of that theory. What was this? This was a proposition proposed by Governor Pete Wilson in 1994, and it was meant to discourage illegal immigration by reducing the services available to them. And the reason why I'm skeptical of this idea is that Democrats were starting to do better before the proposition. So they did well in the 1990 and 1992 elections, and that was before Prop 187 became a thing. And then when Prop 187 was proposed, it actually passed in Monterey County. So it was popular enough that they won the majority of the vote there, and the majority voted for it. Also, Pete Wilson carried Monterey in 1994 when he ran for re-election. So he did better in 94 after proposing this proposition than he had done in 1990. So rather than causing the Republican demise, it may have actually given them a little bit of a last gasp, a last lease on life, so to speak, something that could keep them somewhat successful for a little bit longer. But eventually other forces are going to lead to the decay of the Republicans. And we see now in California, the Republicans are very much in low numbers in the legislature and in the congressional delegation. So the only other Republican that would carry Monterey County in a statewide election would be Arnold Schwarzenegger when he runs for governor. But after him, no other statewide office seeker would be able to carry Monterey County as a Republican. Now let's shift gears and talk about some celebrities that grew up in Monterey County. Anna Akana is something of a Renaissance person. She's a YouTuber, a comedian, a voice actress, a regular actress. She's very prolific. She's done a lot of different stuff. You can check out some of her work on YouTube, or maybe see some of the TV shows or movies that she's done. And she's, done, like I said, quite a lot of stuff. Now, I mentioned earlier that Clint Eastwood had ties to Monterey County. He had been the mayor. His son, Scott Eastwood, grew up in the area area and then became an actor himself later in life. He starred in movies such as The Longest Ride, Dangerous, and Alarum. I got to admit, I have not seen any of his movies, but if you have seen them and if you're a fan of Scott Eastwood and ever wondered what county he has ties to, well, here it is, Monterey County. Now, the other thing is baseball is extremely popular in this part of California. It's because it's an all year round. You can play baseball all year round. A lot of good baseball players have come from different parts of California. So as far as Monterey County goes, here are some of the big stars. You had Pete Incaviglia, who, played for over a decade, and he was something of a journeyman. He had, pretty respectable career. He was part of that famed 1993 Phillies team. Xavier Nady, another, gentleman who had a pretty long career, played for several different teams and had a pretty respectable career numbers. And I think one thing that they have in common, both Xavier Nady and Pete Incaviglia accomplished something that's fairly rare these days and those days in baseball. They played their first major league game without playing any minor league games. So that's pretty rare, but both of these gentlemen from Monterey County were able to do that. And it was probably from all that playing time that they got playing all year baseball. And Mike Aldretti is another good baseball player from the area, and he had quite a successful career, including a stint with the local Giant team, the San Francisco Giants. Now, for those of you who ever played RBI baseball, and I played many, many hours of it, you may recall Mike Aldretti being a bit immortalized by being a character you could play in that game if you're using the Giants, and that was probably his best year as RBI baseball used 1987 for statistics, and that was the year that Mike Aldretti hit 327. So good for him that he got immortalized during that year where he had his best batting average. So that's the average that they use when you're playing RBI baseball and you're using Mike Aldretti. Besides baseball, surfing is also popular in Monterey County. Perhaps not as intense as it is in Santa Cruz County or some of the Southern California communities, but it does have a steady following. Now, in Southern California, you're more likely to see surfers wearing bathing suits and swimming trunks, but like in Santa Cruz, the water is rather cold in Monterey and the surrounding area, so people who are going to surf in Monterey are much more likely to wear full body suits. When playing volleyball, on the other hand, you're less likely to see people wearing full body suits, as people will play volleyball in all kinds of different attire, a lot of times in their bathing suits. So beach volleyball is going to be very popular in Monterey County as well. So Monterey is definitely a good place to visit with a good abundance of activities to engage in and a lot of things to learn about. I'm sure I've only just scratched the surface, so I'd welcome any comments in the comments section from people wishing to share their own thoughts or experiences regarding Monterey County. And this is going to conclude my trilogy of these California counties. If and when I do another video in this county series, I will pick a county in a different state, as I'll want to switch gears and maybe see some different states and future videos. Now, how soon I'll do that will depend on the response this video gets. I don't pretend to understand the YouTube algorithm, I must admit, but some say that it is bad to drastically switch themes, and that may explain why the earlier videos I did in this county series got fairly low views. But I switched themes even more drastically when I did that recent Jason Voorhees video, and that got my largest number of views, and and it also got the largest numbers of likes to date. So maybe switching topics isn't so bad after all. I don't know, only time will tell. But if you enjoy this kind of content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. And if you like other kinds of content, look at some of the other videos I've done in this exploration and analysis channel.